In the spring of 1943, Winston Churchill confessed to his war cabinet the single greatest fear that haunted his sleep. It was not the Luftwaffe raining bombs on London. It was not Rommel's tanks threatening the Suez Canal. It was not even the spectre of a cross-channel invasion by the Wehrmacht. The thing that truly terrified him was the grey wolves hunting beneath the Atlantic waves. German submarines were sinking Allied ships faster than anyone could build them. And simple mathematics said that if this continued, Britain would starve within months. Churchill understood this danger better than anyone. As First Lord of the Admiralty during the First World War, he had watched German U-boats bring Britain to the edge of starvation in 1917. Now, a quarter-century later, the same nightmare was unfolding again, only this time with more sophisticated submarines, more deadly torpedoes, and a German commander who had learned every lesson from the previous war. The Battle of the Atlantic had become a war of subtraction. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, understood this calculation perfectly. He called it tonnage warfare. The strategy was elegant in its brutality. Sink enough merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and weapons across the Atlantic, and the Allies would simply run out of everything they needed to fight. Dönitz calculated that if his submarines could destroy 700,000 tons of shipping per month, the Allies could never recover. Britain would wither. The American war machine would have no way to reach Europe. The war would end before it truly began. Dönitz had developed the tactics that made this strategy possible. In the First World War, submarines had operated alone, hunting independently across the sea lanes. But Dönitz recognized that a single submarine could only attack one ship at a time, giving convoys a chance to scatter and escape. His solution was the Wolf Pack. Instead of hunting alone, U-boats would form groups of 8 to 20 submarines. When one boat spotted a convoy, it would shadow the merchantmen while radioing their position to headquarters. Dönitz would then direct other submarines to converge on the target from multiple directions. When night fell, the Wolfpack would strike simultaneously, overwhelming the escort vessels and tearing the convoy apart. The mathematics of the Wolfpack were devastating. A convoy might have 4 or 5 escort ships to protect 30 or 40 merchantmen. Against a single submarine, those escorts could provide reasonable protection. Against a dozen U-boats attacking from every direction in the darkness, the escorts were simply overwhelmed. They could not be everywhere at once. While they chased one submarine, others were torpedoing ships on the opposite side of the convoy. By early 1943, the Germans were winning this grim arithmetic. In March of that year alone, U-boats sent 120 Allied ships to the bottom of the ocean. That was 693,000 tons of steel and cargo disappearing beneath the waves in just 31 days. The convoy system that was supposed to protect merchant vessels was failing catastrophically. The worst moment came in mid-March, when convoys SC-122 and HX-229 sailed into a trap that seemed designed to demonstrate the hopelessness of the Allied position. 38 U-boats had formed the largest Wolfpack of the war, waiting in a patrol line stretching across the convoy routes. For 4 days, from March 16th through the 20th, the submarines savaged both convoys relentlessly. 22 ships went to the bottom, carrying 146,000 tons of desperately needed supplies. The escorts sank only one U-boat in return. It was the worst convoy disaster of the entire war. The men who commanded the Allied navies watched these numbers with growing horror. At this rate, the entire strategic position of the Western Allies would collapse. There would be no build-up of forces in Britain. No invasion of occupied Europe. No second front to relieve the Soviets fighting for their lives in the East. Everything depended on solving an impossible equation. Somehow, the Allies needed to build ships faster than the Germans could sink them. The answer to this equation would come from the most unlikely of places and from the most unlikely of men. Henry J. Kaiser had never built a ship in his life. His expertise was in concrete, not steel. His fame came from constructing some of the largest dams in American history. He had been part of the consortium that built the Hoover Dam, taming the Colorado River and creating the largest reservoir in the United States. He had led the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River, an even more massive project that would become the largest concrete structure in North America. Kaiser understood how to manage complexity on an industrial scale. Building a dam required coordinating thousands of workers, managing logistics that stretched across multiple states, and solving engineering problems that had never been encountered before. He had learned to break enormous projects into manageable components, to identify bottlenecks before they became crises, and to innovate ruthlessly when traditional methods proved too slow. When Kaiser first approached the United States Maritime Commission with his ideas about mass-producing cargo ships, the traditional shipbuilders laughed at him. The established shipyards on the East Coast had been building vessels the same way for generations. Each ship was essentially a custom creation, assembled by highly skilled craftsmen who had learned their trade over decades. Master shipwrights commanded wages that reflected years of apprenticeship. The notion that a dam builder from the West Coast could revolutionize this ancient industry seemed absurd. But Kaiser saw something the traditionalists missed. He looked at a ship and saw not a unique work of maritime craftsmanship, but a collection of components that could be manufactured separately and assembled like a giant puzzle. The same principles that had allowed him to build dams on schedule and under budget could transform shipbuilding from an art into an industrial process. He proposed something revolutionary. Instead of building each ship from the keel up in a single location, why not prefabricate entire sections in factories scattered across the country and then weld them together at the shipyard? The design Kaiser would mass-produce was called the Liberty ship. Its origins lay not in American engineering but in British desperation. In 1940, with France fallen and the U-boats prowling the Atlantic approaches, Britain urgently needed cargo ships to replace its mounting losses. British designers created a simple, functional vessel called the Ocean Class, based on the Sunderland tramp steamer that had hauled cargo across the world's oceans for decades. When Britain could not produce enough of these ships domestically, they turned to American shipyards for help. The American version of the Ocean Class became the Liberty ship. It was not a beautiful vessel. Admiral Emory S. Land, chairman of the United States Maritime Commission, looked at the design and remarked that it was a real ugly duckling. The nickname stuck. The official designation was EC2 SC1, an emergency cargo ship of roughly 10,800 deadweight tons. The hull stretched 441 feet and 6 inches in length. The beam measured 56 feet and 10 3/4 inches. The ship rode low in the water, designed to carry the maximum possible cargo rather than to impress anyone with its lines. The engineering was deliberately simple. Rather than modern turbine engines, the Liberty ships used triple-expansion reciprocating steam engines, a technology that dated back to the First World War. These engines were old-fashioned and relatively slow, pushing the ships along at a maximum speed of 11 knots. A modern liner could make twice that speed. But the old engines were also easy to manufacture, simple to operate, and could be repaired by engineers without specialized training. American factories were already tooled to produce this type of engine. Converting to turbines would have meant months of retooling delay. In a war where ships were being sunk by the dozens, simplicity mattered more than elegance. Everything about the Liberty ship design prioritized production speed over sophistication. The hull was made from standard flat plates that required no complex curves or custom fabrication. The superstructure was minimal. The accommodations for the crew were Spartan. Each ship contained roughly 250,000 individual parts, but those parts were standardized so that any shipyard could produce them. A propeller shaft made in Portland would fit perfectly on a ship assembled in Baltimore. Interchangeability was the key that made mass production possible. Before Kaiser could transform American shipbuilding, the U-boats enjoyed what their commanders called the happy times. These were periods of slaughter that almost decided the war before the Liberty ships could make a difference. The first happy time began in July of 1940 and lasted through October of that year. With France conquered, German submarines could now operate from bases on the French Atlantic coast. The U-boat pens at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, La Pallice, and Bordeaux cut hundreds of miles off the journey to the hunting grounds. Submarines that had previously struggled to reach the convoy routes now arrived with full fuel tanks and fresh crews. German submarines operated off the coast of Britain with near impunity, picking off merchant ships that sailed without adequate escort. The Royal Navy was stretched impossibly thin, with destroyers needed everywhere at once. Many convoys sailed with only 1 or 2 escorts, or sometimes none at all. In those 4 months, the U-boats sank 282 ships, totaling 1.49 million tons. They lost only 5 submarines in return. The exchange rate was catastrophic for the Allies. The ace commanders became celebrities in Germany. Otto Kretschmer, commanding U-99, sank 45 ships, totaling approximately 259,000 tons, before his capture in March of 1941. Joachim Schepke, in U-100, destroyed 36 ships. Gunther Prien, who had famously penetrated the defences of Scapa Flow to sink the battleship Royal Oak, added another 30 merchant ships to his tally before his death in March of 1941. These men received decorations, newspaper coverage, and the personal attention of Adolf Hitler himself. But the second happy time was even worse. After America entered the war in December of 1941, Admiral Dönitz immediately turned his attention to the American coastline. He sent 5 long-range submarines in an operation codenamed Paukenschlag, meaning drumbeat, to patrol the shipping lanes along the east coast. What they found exceeded their wildest expectations. American cities had not implemented blackout procedures. Ships sailing from New York or Miami or New Orleans were silhouetted against the bright lights of the shoreline, making them perfect targets for submarines lurking in the darkness offshore. Coastal shipping had continued with peacetime routines, vessels sailing independently without escorts or convoys. The American Navy had virtually no anti-submarine capability in these waters. It was, as one German commander later described it, like shooting fish in a barrel. The results were devastating. From January through August of 1942, U-boats operating in American waters sank 609 ships, totaling 3.1 million tons. German submarine commanders could hardly believe their good fortune. Captain Reinhard Hardigan, commanding U-123, sank 9 ships in a single patrol ranging from New York and Long Island down to Cape Hatteras. The beaches of New Jersey and Florida became littered with wreckage and bodies. Oil from torpedoed tankers washed ashore in great black slicks. Vacationers at beach resorts watched ships burning on the horizon. Yet in all this carnage, the Americans managed to destroy only 22 U-boats. The merchant mariners who sailed these ships endured conditions that defy imagination. They were civilians, technically, though they faced dangers that rivaled any combat soldiers in the war. The merchant marine was not a military service. The men who crewed merchant ships were employees of private shipping companies, paid by the voyage and entitled to none of the benefits that military personnel received. Yet they sailed into the same waters where U-boats hunted, aboard ships that carried the same cargoes, and died in the same numbers. A typical convoy crossing of the North Atlantic took 2 to 3 weeks. During that time, the crew lived in constant awareness that at any moment a torpedo could turn their ship into a flaming wreck. Merchant ships had minimal armament, usually just a few guns mounted on the deck and manned by a small Navy armed guard detachment. Against a submarine attack, these weapons were essentially useless. The U-boats attacked at night, invisible in the darkness, and a torpedo would strike without warning. The attacks usually came in the hours after midnight. A submarine would surface in the darkness, position itself ahead of the convoy, and wait for the merchant ships to steam into range. The U-boat captain would pick his targets carefully, looking for tankers carrying fuel or ammunition ships that would explode spectacularly. The first warning might be the phosphorescent trail of a torpedo streaking through the black water. Then came the explosion, a massive concussion that could break a ship's back and send it plunging beneath the waves in minutes. For the men aboard a torpedoed vessel, survival depended on speed and luck. If the ship carried fuel oil, the explosion might be followed by a fireball that consumed everything on deck. Men caught in burning oil had no chance at all. If the cargo was heavy machinery or iron ore, the vessel might plunge straight to the bottom before anyone could reach the lifeboats. Even those who made it into the water faced death from hypothermia in the frigid North Atlantic. In winter, water temperatures hovered just above freezing. A man without a life jacket might survive 5 minutes. With a life jacket, perhaps 30 minutes, if he was strong and lucky. The convoy commodores had standing orders not to stop for survivors. Stopping made the rescuing ship a sitting target for the submarine that was certainly still lurking nearby. Merchant seamen in the water watched their former convoy mates steam past, knowing that rescue might come hours later, or might not come at all. Many died waiting. The casualty rates reflected this brutal reality. Of the approximately 243,000 Americans who served in the merchant marine during the war, 9,521 lost their lives. That was a fatality rate of 3.9%, higher than any branch of the American military. More than half of these deaths occurred in 1942 alone, during the second happy time when the U-boats prowled virtually unchallenged off the American coast. The merchant marine was, proportionally, the deadliest service in which an American could serve. Perhaps no engagement better illustrated both the courage and the vulnerability of the merchant mariners than the battle between SS Stephen Hopkins and the German raider Stier. On September 27, 1942, the Hopkins was sailing alone in the South Atlantic when she encountered the Stier, a heavily armed commerce raider disguised as a merchant vessel. The Germans also had a supply ship, the Tannenfels, accompanying them. The Hopkins had stumbled into the worst possible situation, alone and outgunned against enemies who could not afford to let her escape to report their position. The Hopkins was hopelessly outgunned. She carried only a single 4-inch gun mounted on her stern and two 37mm guns. The Stier alone mounted 6 5.9-inch guns, plus numerous smaller weapons. Any rational calculation said the American ship should have surrendered immediately. The Germans fully expected her to do so. Instead, the Hopkins fought back. Captain Paul Buck ordered his crew to their battle stations and turned his stern toward the enemy to bring his only effective weapon to bear. Cadet Midshipman Edwin O'Hara, just 18 years old and recently graduated from the Merchant Marine Academy, manned the stern gun and began firing at the Stier despite being wounded multiple times by German shells. For approximately 30 minutes, the little merchantman traded shells with her far more powerful opponent. The Hopkins was hit repeatedly. Fires broke out throughout the ship. The engine room was destroyed, leaving her dead in the water. Most of her crew were killed or wounded, but O'Hara kept his gun in action, scoring hits that set the German raider ablaze. Other crew members manned the 37mm guns until they too were killed. When the battle ended, both the Hopkins and the Stier were sinking. The American ship went down with most of her crew, including Captain Buck and Cadet O'Hara. But the Stier, fatally damaged by the accurate fire from the Hopkins, also slipped beneath the waves. A lone cargo ship had taken a purpose-built warship with her to the bottom. 19 survivors from the Hopkins drifted in a lifeboat, enduring 31 days and over 2,000 miles of open ocean before reaching the coast of Brazil. 4 men died during the voyage. Only 15 ultimately survived. O'Hara was posthumously awarded the Merchant Marine Distinguished Service Medal, and a Liberty ship was later named SS Edwin Joseph O'Hara in his honor. Back in the shipyards, Henry Kaiser was revolutionizing how ships were built. The traditional shipbuilders had dismissed him as an outsider who knew nothing about their craft. They were right that he knew nothing about traditional shipbuilding, but Kaiser understood something more important. He understood mass production. The key innovation was prefabrication on a scale never before attempted in shipbuilding. Rather than constructing each vessel from raw steel plates in the shipyard, Kaiser's system manufactured entire sections of the ship in factories miles from the water. The concept borrowed from automobile manufacturing, where Henry Ford had proven that complex machines could be assembled from standardized parts, produced in multiple locations. The process began with the steel plates being cut and shaped at inland facilities. Workers who had never seen the ocean assembled these plates into standardized modules, each weighing up to 250 tons. The bow section, the engine room, the cargo holds, the bridge superstructure, all were built separately and then transported to the shipyard by rail or truck. When these massive sections arrived at the shipyard, much of the difficult work had already been completed. At the shipyard, the prefabricated modules were lifted by enormous cranes and positioned on the building ways. Traditional shipbuilding assembled a vessel plate by plate, rivet by rivet, with skilled craftsmen measuring and fitting each piece individually. Kaiser's method assembled the ship like a 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, with pre-made sections that were designed to fit together precisely. Instead of riveting each plate individually, workers used electric welding to join the sections together. Welding was faster than riveting, it required less skilled labor, and it created a hull with fewer seams and potential leak points. A riveted ship of the same size would have required millions of individual rivets, each one hammered into place by a skilled riveter. The welding also opened shipbuilding to workers who had been excluded from traditional yards. Riveting required years of training and considerable physical strength. The riveter had to be strong enough to handle the heavy rivet gun for hours at a time, and skilled enough to drive each rivet perfectly flush with the plate. Welding could be taught relatively quickly, and the electric welding torch was light enough for almost anyone to handle. Women flooded into the Kaiser shipyards, eventually comprising over 27% of the workforce at the Richmond yards. Rosie the Riveter became famous, but Wendy the Welder was doing equally important work on the West Coast. Kaiser recruited his workforce from across America. Workers came from farms and small towns, from the South and the Midwest, drawn by wages that far exceeded anything they could earn at home. African Americans found opportunities in the Kaiser yards that were denied to them elsewhere, though they still faced discrimination and were often relegated to the least desirable jobs. The shipyards became vast melting pots where people who had never worked in heavy industry learned to build ocean-going vessels in a matter of weeks. Kaiser's Richmond shipyards in California became the showcase for this industrial revolution. 4 separate yards lined the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay, sprawling complexes of cranes and building ways and prefabrication shops. At their peak, these 4 yards employed over 90,000 workers operating around the clock in 3 shifts. The assembly line never stopped. As one Liberty ship slid down the ways and into the water, another was already taking shape behind it. The work continued through the night, illuminated by banks of floodlights that made the yards visible for miles. The improvement in construction time was nothing short of staggering. The first Liberty ship, SS Patrick Henry, was laid down on April 30th, 1941, and launched on September 27th of that year, after 244 days of construction. The ship was named to honor the revolutionary patriot who had declared, "Give me liberty, or give me death," and her launch on Liberty Fleet Day was a carefully orchestrated publicity event. Within a year, Kaiser's shipyards had reduced average construction time to 70 days. The improvement came from experience, from better organization, and from the accumulated learning of thousands of workers who grew more skilled with each ship they built. By 1943, the median time from keel laying to launch had fallen to 39 days. Some yards achieved even faster results. The Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation consistently launched Liberty ships in just 17 days. Then came the publicity stunt that captured the world's attention. In November of 1942, Kaiser announced that his Richmond Yard No. 2 would build a complete Liberty ship in record time. On November 8th, workers laid the keel of SS Robert E. Peary. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later, the completed ship slid into San Francisco Bay. The Peary was fully outfitted and ready for sea trials. It was a feat that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The record was not entirely fair to normal shipbuilding. Kaiser had stockpiled all the necessary materials in advance. Every rivet, every pipe, every piece of machinery was ready and waiting before the keel was laid. The workers rehearsed their roles like actors in a play, practicing their moves until every motion was perfect. Many of the welds were completed on the prefabricated sections before the official clock started. The whole exercise was more demonstration than normal production. But the propaganda value was enormous. Newspapers across the country carried photographs of the Peary sliding down the ways. Newsreels showed the time-lapse footage of the ship taking shape almost faster than the eye could follow. If American industry could build a ship in less than 5 days, surely the U-boats could never win the tonnage war. The record was a message to Germany, to Britain, and to America itself. Yet the welded hulls of the Liberty ships and other wartime vessels harbored a deadly secret that would not be fully understood until much later. In January of 1943, the tanker SS Schenectady was lying at the fitting-out dock in Portland, Oregon, having just completed sea trials. The night was cold but calm. There were no heavy seas, no unusual stresses on the hull. The ship was fully loaded and ready for her maiden voyage. Without warning, the ship's hull cracked catastrophically. The deck and sides fractured while the bottom plating held, causing the vessel to jackknife dramatically. The only thing preventing the ship from sinking completely was the quayside that caught the broken hull. The Schenectady was a T2 tanker rather than a Liberty ship, but the same welded construction methods had been used throughout the emergency shipbuilding program. Throughout the war, approximately 1,500 welded vessels experienced significant structural fractures. Some were minor cracks that could be repaired. Others were catastrophic failures that destroyed the ship. About 3 Liberty ships and several tankers broke completely in two, some while at sea with their crews aboard. The problem was not poor workmanship or defective materials. It was something far more subtle that engineers were only beginning to understand. These vessels were victims of a phenomenon called brittle fracture. Steel, like all metals, behaves differently at different temperatures. At normal temperatures, steel is ductile, meaning it can bend and deform without breaking. But as temperatures drop, steel becomes more brittle. A crack that would be stopped by the material's ductility at room temperature can propagate explosively through cold steel. The welded seams that made construction so fast also created continuous stress paths through the hull. In a riveted ship, a crack would stop when it reached the edge of a plate. The gap between plates, filled with the rivet heads, acted as a natural crack arrestor. But in a welded ship, the hull plates were fused into a single continuous sheet of steel. A crack could propagate through the entire structure in seconds, racing through the welds at speeds approaching the speed of sound. The investigation into these failures would eventually revolutionize the science of fracture mechanics. Engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory and universities across the country studied the broken ships, analyzing the fractured steel and testing samples under controlled conditions. They learned that small defects in the steel, invisible to the naked eye, could initiate catastrophic cracks under the right conditions. They discovered that certain stress concentration points, particularly the square corners of cargo hatches, were especially prone to crack initiation. The lessons learned from these failures changed how engineers designed and built steel structures. Crack arrestors were added to hulls, riveted seams that would stop a fracture from spreading. The corners of hatches were rounded to reduce stress concentration. Steel manufacturing processes were improved to reduce the sulfur content that made the metal more prone to brittleness. The science of fracture mechanics, born from the failures of wartime welded ships, would inform structural engineering for generations to come. Despite the fracture problems, the sheer volume of Liberty ship production was overwhelming the U-boat threat. The numbers told the story of an industrial miracle. In 1941, before America entered the war, American shipyards launched just 134 merchant ships, totaling approximately 1 million deadweight tons. In 1942, the first full year of American participation, that number exploded to 746 ships. The shipyards were still ramping up production, still learning the techniques that would make mass production possible, but already they were launching more than 2 ships per day. In 1943, the peak year of wartime production, American yards delivered 1,896 merchant vessels, totaling 19 million deadweight tons. That was more than 5 ships per day, every day, for the entire year. The Liberty ship program alone produced 2,710 ships by the end of the war, with a combined capacity of over 29 million deadweight tons. These numbers dwarfed anything the German submarine fleet could hope to destroy. The cost efficiency achieved by the Liberty ship program was remarkable. The first Liberty ships cost roughly $2 million each. As production volumes increased and workers gained experience, the price dropped to about $1.7 million per vessel. More importantly, the man-hours required to build each ship fell from approximately 1.4 million to under 500,000. Each successive ship required less time, less labor, and less money than the one before. This was the power of the learning curve, the systematic improvement that comes from repetition and experience. Meanwhile, the Allies were learning to kill submarines. The technological convergence of 1943 gave convoy escorts capabilities they had lacked before. Centimetric radar, operating at 10-centimeter wavelengths, could detect the conning tower of a surfaced U-boat at ranges that gave commanders time to react. Unlike the earlier metric radar, which the Germans had learned to detect with their own receivers, the centimetric radar operated on frequencies that German equipment could not pick up. For the first time, U-boats could be detected before they attacked. High-frequency direction-finding equipment, which the sailors called Huff Duff, could pinpoint a submarine's location when it transmitted radio messages. The Wolfpack tactics that had made U-boats so deadly depended on radio communication. When a submarine spotted a convoy, it had to report the position to headquarters. Now those reports could be detected and located, allowing escorts to sweep ahead of the convoy and force the shadowing submarine to dive. Aircraft equipped with powerful searchlights and improved depth charges could hunt U-boats far out into the Atlantic, closing the mid-ocean gap where submarines had previously operated with impunity. The air gap, as it was called, had been the killing ground where wolf packs assembled beyond the range of land-based aircraft. Now, very long-range patrol bombers, equipped with radar and enough fuel to reach the gap, could provide continuous air cover across the entire convoy route. The breaking of the German naval Enigma codes added another crucial dimension to the Allied advantage. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park in England, building on work begun by Polish mathematicians before the war, could often read German submarine communications in near real time. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, allowed convoys to route around known wolfpack positions. The U-boats lost the element of surprise that had made them so deadly. The turning point came in May of 1943, a month that the Germans would remember as Black May. In those 31 days, the Allies destroyed 43 German submarines. This was fully 25% of the operational U-boat fleet, a rate of loss that no navy could sustain. The exchange rate had reversed completely. Instead of trading dozens of ships for each submarine, the Allies were now sinking U-boats faster than Germany could replace them. The hunters had become the hunted. The causes of this sudden reversal were multiple. The new technologies played their part. So did improved tactics and better coordination between surface escorts and patrol aircraft. But the fundamental change was mathematical. The Allies now had enough escort vessels, enough aircraft, and enough radar sets to cover the convoy routes properly. American industrial production had provided the tools. The crews had learned how to use them. Admiral Dönitz, who had become commander of the entire German Navy in January of that year, was forced to make the most difficult decision of his career. On May 24th, he ordered the withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The wolf packs that had nearly strangled Britain were pulled back to port. For the first time since 1940, the shipping lanes to Britain were relatively safe. The tonnage war was over, and America's ugly ducklings had won. The contribution of the Liberty ships extended far beyond the Battle of the Atlantic. These workhorses of the merchant fleet carried the supplies that made victory possible on every front. They transported Sherman tanks to North Africa for the campaign against Rommel. They brought aviation fuel to Britain for the bomber offensive against Germany. They hauled jeeps and trucks and artillery pieces to ports throughout the Mediterranean and the Pacific. When Operation Overlord finally launched on June 6, 1944, Liberty ships were among the thousands of vessels that crossed the English Channel. The invasion fleet numbered nearly 7,000 ships, the largest armada ever assembled in history. Among them were the Liberty ships, carrying the ammunition that soldiers fired on the beaches of Normandy. They brought the fuel that powered Patton's tanks across France. They delivered the food that fed the largest military force ever assembled on European soil. Some Liberty ships served a final purpose on the Normandy beaches. Old vessels, deemed too worn out for further service, were filled with concrete and sunk in shallow water to form breakwaters. These block ships, as they were called, created artificial harbours where supplies could be landed even without access to a conventional port. The Mulberry harbours that supported the Allied advance through France were built around these sacrificial vessels. The Arctic convoys to Russia relied heavily on Liberty ships, despite conditions that pushed both ships and crews to their absolute limits. The route to Murmansk and Archangel passed through some of the most hostile waters on Earth. German aircraft based in Norway could reach the convoys throughout much of the route. U-boats lurked beneath the ice floes. The battleship Tirpitz, hiding in the Norwegian fjords, posed a constant threat, but the weather was often worse than the enemy. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Sea spray froze instantly on decks and superstructures, accumulating so rapidly that ships could become top-heavy and capsize within hours. The ice built up relentlessly, coating gun barrels, clogging ventilators, and adding tons of weight high above the waterline. Crews worked in shifts with axes and steam hoses, desperately chipping away the ice to keep their vessels upright. Men working on deck risked frostbite in minutes. Falls into the water meant death in seconds. 78 Arctic convoys delivered approximately 4 million tons of war material to the Soviet Union via the northern route. Additional supplies flowed through the Persian Corridor and across the Pacific, bringing total Lend-Lease deliveries to over 17 million tons. The cargoes included hundreds of thousands of trucks, thousands of armoured vehicles, and thousands of aircraft. This material helped sustain the Red Army during the most desperate years of the war on the Eastern Front. 85 merchant vessels were lost on the Arctic route, their crews perishing in waters so cold that survival outside a ship was measured in minutes rather than hours. The convoy PQ-17 suffered the worst single disaster when the British Admiralty, fearing attack by the Tirpitz, ordered the convoy to scatter and the escorts to withdraw. Left unprotected, the merchant ships were hunted down individually by aircraft and submarines over the following days. 24 of 35 ships were sunk. 2/3 of the cargo was lost. It was a catastrophe that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. As the war ended, the Liberty ships found new purposes that their designers had never imagined. The American government had built far more ships than it needed for peacetime trade. Hundreds of Liberty ships were declared surplus and offered for sale at bargain prices. The Greek shipping industry, devastated by war and occupation, saw an opportunity. Greek ship owners, some operating from exile in London or New York, began acquiring surplus Liberty ships at prices that seemed impossibly low. 526 of these vessels became the foundation of a reborn Greek merchant marine. Entrepreneurs like Aristotle Onassis and Stavros Niarchos built shipping empires on the cheap, reliable hulls of American emergency construction. The Liberty ships were old, slow, and obsolete, but they were available and affordable. Greek owners ran them hard, extracting every possible voyage from their aging machinery. Today, Greek ship owners control roughly 21% of the world's merchant fleet, a dominance that traces directly back to those post-war Liberty ship purchases. The ugly ducklings that had carried the arsenal of democracy across the Atlantic became the foundation of one of the world's great maritime industries. Of the 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war, only 3 survive today as operational museum vessels. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien rests at Pier 35 in San Francisco, maintained by volunteers who keep her engines operational. In 1994, 50 years after D-Day, the O'Brien made a remarkable voyage back to Normandy under her own power, the only large vessel from the original invasion fleet to return for the anniversary. Her crew was mostly elderly veterans of the wartime merchant marine, making one last voyage to honor their fallen shipmates. The SS John W. Brown is berthed in Baltimore, where the Project Liberty ship organization operates her for living history cruises. The SS Hellas Liberty serves as a static museum in Piraeus, Greece, honoring the ships that rebuilt an entire nation's maritime industry. These 3 vessels are all that remain afloat of the vast fleet that once numbered in the thousands. The most painful legacy of the merchant mariners took decades to resolve. Unlike military personnel, the men who served on merchant ships during the war received no veterans' benefits. They were civilians in the eyes of the law, employees of private shipping companies rather than members of the armed forces. This distinction made little sense to men who had faced the same torpedoes, the same burning oil, and the same freezing water as their counterparts in the Navy. But the law was clear. They were not veterans. They received no GI Bill for education, no VA loans for housing, no medical care for injuries sustained in service. They could not be buried in national cemeteries with full military honors. They received no pensions, no disability payments, and no recognition of the service they had rendered. Many spent their entire post-war lives struggling with the physical and psychological wounds of their service, while being denied any official recognition of what they had endured. The men who had kept Britain alive and made the invasion of Europe possible returned home to find themselves forgotten. The campaign for recognition lasted 43 years. Surviving merchant mariners and their families and advocates petitioned Congress repeatedly, arguing that men who had faced the same dangers as military personnel deserved the same benefits and recognition. Veterans organizations initially opposed granting merchant mariners the same status, fearing it might dilute their own benefits or set a precedent for other groups. The bureaucratic obstacles seemed insurmountable. Not until 1988 did Congress finally grant veteran status to World War II merchant mariners, allowing the survivors to access the benefits they had earned 4 decades earlier. By then, many had already died. The average age of surviving merchant mariners at the time of recognition was 75. They had waited half a lifetime for acknowledgement that never came for most of their shipmates. When historians calculate the cost of the Battle of the Atlantic, they count ships and submarines, tonnage and U-boats, military dead and strategic turning points. The numbers are staggering. The Allies lost approximately 14.7 million gross register tons of merchant shipping to all causes during the war. This included ships sunk by submarines, aircraft, mines, surface raiders, and accidents. The U-boats alone accounted for most of these losses. Germany lost 783 of the approximately 1,154 U-boats it commissioned during the war. Along with these submarines went approximately 30,000 of the 40,000 men who served in the submarine fleet. That was a casualty rate of approximately 75%, higher than any other branch of German military service. The U-boat arm that had nearly won the war became a death trap for the men who served in it. But the truest measure of victory came from the shipyards. American industry built 38 million tons of merchant shipping during the war, more than double what the U-boats could sink. Henry Kaiser's radical vision of prefabricated, welded, assembly line shipbuilding had turned an impossible equation into a mathematical certainty. The grey wolves of the Atlantic could not destroy ships faster than American workers could build them. The Battle of the Atlantic was won in the shipyards of America. The Liberty ships were never elegant. They were slow, prone to cracking, and obsolete almost as soon as they were built. Their design incorporated engine technology from the previous war. Their hulls were welded by workers who had learned shipbuilding in weeks rather than years. Admiral Land was right to call them ugly ducklings. But in the arithmetic of total war, these homely vessels added up to something beautiful. They proved that industrial democracy could outproduce military dictatorship. They demonstrated that American workers, many of them women entering heavy industry for the first time, could achieve miracles when given the chance. They carried the arsenal of democracy across the most contested ocean on Earth, delivering victory one cargo load at a time. 9,521 American merchant mariners gave their lives in this effort. They sailed into waters they knew were deadly, aboard ships they knew were targets, protected by nothing but a few deck guns and their own courage. They did this voyage after voyage, convoy after convoy, until the war was won. They were civilians in technical classification, but they faced combat as surely as any soldier or sailor in uniform. Today, when container ships cross the Atlantic in days rather than weeks, when satellite navigation has replaced dead reckoning and radar has made submarine ambush nearly impossible, the desperate urgency of the Battle of the Atlantic has faded from memory. The shipyards where Kaiser worked his industrial magic have been converted to other uses or demolished entirely. The men and women who built Liberty ships in record time are almost all gone now. But in San Francisco and Baltimore and Piraeus, 3 old ships remain. Their engines are quieter now, their holds empty of the cargo that once filled them, yet they still carry something precious. They carry the memory of a time when simple arithmetic said the Allies would lose the war, and American workers simply refused to accept that equation. They built ships faster than anyone thought possible, until the numbers finally added up to victory. The Liberty ships were ugly ducklings. They were also the ships that won the war.